Now, I'd like to request that we stand up. I just want to have a bit of a shake-up. Please stand for a second. Then,
and the city wants to come and lead the dance.
Right. Yeah, so please, we just want to ensure that the blood is flowing fully, and then we can be able to go to the... Okay, just a bit of circulation of the blood as we welcome Prof. Tim Davis to come and lead us in the next session. He's from the Boland Institute for International Agriculture and Department of Horticultural Science at Texas A&M University. So here we go. Tim, welcome.
Very good. Well, first of all, I apologize I interrupted the chicken dance, so sorry about that. So, I have a very long title that I was assigned. I'm not going to read it because it may take me 20 minutes to read it, so we want to keep this moving. You can see the title in the program. Now, I feel a little bit here, a little difficult situation because I realize I'm the only thing standing between you and dinner. So I feel a little bit like I'm stuck between the lion and its prey, and so I think my only chance for survival is to move quickly, so I will try to do that. All right, so what I want to talk about today, just shortening the title a little bit, is to talk about evidence-based development in support of the African horticulture sector. So that's really what I want to cover. I want to talk briefly about the anatomy of a typical agricultural development project. I want to talk a bit about the differences between agricultural development and research, so we are clear about that. I find that sometimes there's a lot of misunderstanding regarding those two topics. Then I want to talk specifically about the role of this USAID Port Innovation Lab that we're all here for, and some limitations, and then I'll have a few concluding remarks after that. Now, some disclaimers. First of all, I know that Kenya is not in Asia and Eurasia because that's my region that I usually work in, but I'm also here because my hat that I wear, the hat I wear at Texas A&M is professor of horticultural sciences, and I've worked a lot in horticulture for development. And so I do know that Kenya is not in that area. I'm not an expert on African horticulture, although I know a lot about international horticulture. I have spent time at All Africa Horticulture Congress a few years ago, so I did learn a little bit there. But you're the experts here. I consider you the experts on African horticulture. It's been great to be here and hear what you have to say. This is meant to be a presentation as food for thought. Certainly don't have the answers, and what we want to do, and we have been doing for the past couple of days, is trying to develop plans for working effectively here in Africa. And I'm certainly very pleased that you're here and very pleased that I'm here because, as Senator Elizabeth Warren was supposedly said, if you don't have a seat at the table, you're probably on the menu. And so we don't want to be on the menu, okay? We want to be here at the table and hopefully partaking of the rewards, okay? So you don't need to read this slide. I just put it up there to show the complexity of agricultural development projects. I'm going to go into this in more detail so you can actually read it. First of all, we could look at the drivers of agricultural development, and there are many, but here's a few of them. Certainly we need to be consistent with the local government plans. I've heard a lot of comments about government in here, but we still have to deal with the local government strategies. We need to know a lot about the donor strategic plan. In this case, USAID is our donor. They're funding this project. And so we need to know about what their strategies are and what their priorities are. We need to think about some of the constraints that we deal with. In an ag development project, we need to understand clearly what our objectives are, and certainly take into account stakeholder needs as we move into a project. And that's why I'm really glad to see all of you here as stakeholders. I think you understand this, so I'm not going to spend much time on the value chain. It's very important that we consider the development in terms of the entire value chain. I've heard a lot of talk about that, so I think you understand that very well. But we always tell our even beginning horticulture students that if you don't link this chain up nicely from production to the consumer, you won't have a successful horticultural enterprise. You have to deal with all of these parts of the chain, and there can't be parts of that chain broken. So I think you all understand that well. Now, what are the constraints? Well, we know political upheaval can be a problem in a lot of the countries where we work. Hopefully that won't happen in the countries here, but we know that can be a problem. Corruption, I'm sure you have no corruption in Africa, right? There's no problem with that, so we can skip that one right away. No problems, okay. Inadequate funding, I've already heard you have supplemental budgets coming very soon, so you don't have to worry about funding. But on a serious note, that's one real positive of this lab, is this is a fairly large project, and there is money that goes with it. So that's one thing that we have to be very clear about how we're going to use that money wisely. And so of course, we'll be looking at that over the next few months. Security can be a problem. Natural disasters can be a challenge. Lack of key stakeholder input often is a problem for ag development. So that's why I'm so glad that you're all here and have taken the time to provide your input into this. And then, of course, weak local human and institutional capacity can be a constraint. Too many implementers, and they're not coordinated, their efforts, they stumble over each other. That can be a problem. And I know you have no bureaucracy, so maybe I don't need to say anything. No bureaucracy in Africa, correct? Okay. So here's just a few photos of things that I've encountered personally as these constraints. I did a project in Indonesia, and one of our project sites was in a place called Manado, very near Mount Lokan, which is an active volcano, and sometimes it would erupt like this. Fortunately, we knew that it could be a problem, and so we kept the project sites far away from that. But the problem was that when that eruption occurs, airports close. The airport in Manado has to close because you can't fly jet aircraft through air that has a lot of volcanic dust. And so we would have to worry about that happening, not so much that it was a direct impact of lava on our project, but the dust could be a problem. This is something I was in Kabul, Afghanistan, when this report broke. I was just a couple miles away from the American University of Kabul when a terrorist took over that campus in a very tragic incident where students and faculty and staff were killed. We were fortunately not on that campus, but we were about 2 miles away and heard some of the gunfire and the blasts. And so security can surprise you at times and can be a real problem in some of the places where we work. Now, when that happened, we did get our university dean did call us and said, "Are you okay there? And can we do anything?" We said, "Yes, we're fine. Our security team's taking care of us. But you could send a private jet to take us home if you would like." And they didn't do that, so we didn't have a supplemental budget for that. Okay. This is a picture from Bangladesh, a typical street view there in Dhaka. And it's very crowded. And what I'm trying to show here, it's symbolic of the fact that in Bangladesh there are many organizations trying to implement development projects and trying to help. They're well-meaning, but their efforts are not coordinated, and so you end up with a traffic jam in terms of projects, and they stumble over each other, they get in the way of each other, so that can be a challenge. So those are just some of the kinds of things that we can run into. Bureaucracy, I said you don't have this kind of situation, so you don't have much paperwork you have to deal with, and then the red tape, I hope, is not too much of a problem for you. But those are the kinds of things that we see when it comes to these projects. Now, when it comes to the actual project, these are some typical components of a development project. The items highlighted there in blue are the things that I think we'll focus mostly on for the Innovation Lab. One of those is research, and research is not always part of a development project, but fortunately in this, it's really a focal point for our efforts here. But that's where we're generating the evidence. The extension part is where we utilize the evidence. The evidence is no good if we don't use it for any purpose, so we need to have, and I've heard a lot of talk about extension services and the need to improve those, so I think that's got to be part of this. And then, of course, always capacity strengthening. And universities are good at that. Many of the organizations represented here are good at that in terms of strengthening the capacity of individuals and institutions. And so those will be important components, I believe, of the project that we have here. Some of the activities I think you're familiar with. The research is probably mostly going to be applied. I don't see a lot of real basic or fundamental research happening on a project like this. The research needs to be translational, meaning that it will have a landscape level impact. Ultimately, it needs to benefit somebody, and it can't be research just for the sake of research, which is fine in terms of a fundamental type of research, but that's really not what USAID typically is looking for. So this is the part where we're trying to generate evidence to support our development activities. Some of us will be involved in short or long-term technical assistance. That's really the utilizing the evidence part. It's the advisory services and trying to train people and help them to utilize the research results so that they can have a successful enterprise. And then, of course, capacity strengthening, and that could be at the university level, it could be for organizations, businesses, and so forth. And so building extension programs, those kinds of things are typical activities in a horticultural development project. And then, of course, there's the outcomes that are very important. You know about these. I think you're all aware, so I'm not going to read this list. But what I would say is it's very important that we document these outcomes with very clear indicators of when we've reached these outcomes. So, for example, if you just pick poverty reduction, you can't just say you've reduced poverty. You have to provide the evidence that that is in fact the case. And so you have to think ahead of time, what are the indicators that would show that poverty is being reduced? And so that's a really important part of this. I put in a big pitch for monitoring and evaluation as being very key to the success of development programs. And there aren't that many experts in monitoring and evaluation, and so they're very, very valuable when you have a good one. And so we want to be able to monitor and evaluate. And MENL is monitoring, evaluation, and learning. So we also want to be learning as we do this. So these are things that I think are very, very important. Now, lots of possible examples of outcomes. Meaningful data that tells a clear story that's based on strong evidence. That's good to have. Certainly impacts. We want to see not just agricultural. Some of the impacts of what we do here may be economic, environmental, social. And we need to get better at describing those. That's just a general thing I see about universities in particular. We're not really good at clearly documenting and describing impacts. Policy changes. I've heard there's some policies that are creating an environment that makes it difficult to get things done. If we can induce policy changes through this project, that's always very important, and creates that enabling environment that some of you need to do your work. Success stories. USAID likes success stories, and what I mean by success stories is when we can have a business, usually it's a smallholder farmer or maybe a small business owner that can stand up and say how wonderful the project was and how it impacted their business and their life. And you do that on a video, that's worth a lot. So hopefully, in a few years, we'll be able to have some of those kinds of success stories. They just need to be very well documented and based on the truth, of course. They can't just be hype. So if we look at these two types of things, these activities, there's agricultural development, and then there's research project, and I can just do a quick comparison. The development project is typically very broad in scope. A research project is much more narrow and focused. There's relatively large amounts of funding for a big agricultural development project, smaller amounts of funding for the research, typically more in the thousands of dollars instead of millions. And not too often we see a multi-million-dollar research project, but they do happen sometimes. The way the projects are organized and developed and planned are a little bit different. You saw yesterday, if you were here for Erin McGuire's presentation, she gave the theory of change that was used to develop the concept for the Hort Innovation Lab that has now been funded. In a research project, all of you at universities and researchers and government, you know that we have to have a scientific hypothesis and then rigorously follow the scientific method. Interesting thing about agricultural development was a little bit of a switch for me when most of my focus was on research. I found that the work plan is usually developed after the project is actually funded, which is quite different from research, where you better have a very clear work plan when you submit your grant proposal or you won't get funded. In fact, we often joke that the best way to get funded is do the research first and then apply for the grant, and then they fund you because there's very little tolerance of risk in the research world. The other thing, there's many participants and multiple partners in an ag development project, like all of us here. A research project will have fewer participants. There are fewer partners. Hopefully, they're more interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary nowadays. Strengthening local capacity is absolutely critical for an ag development project. Capacity strengthening is kind of a secondary benefit of research. Research projects are usually not funded because they're building capacity. They're funded for the research result itself. And a secondary benefit is that we may get students that are benefited by being educated on how to do research. Ag development projects, political presence is definitely present. Those influences are shunned in research. If we're going to do proper research, it really should be objective and shying away from those political influences. The expected results are landscape level impacts for a development. You have to be able to show that you actually impacted the lives of people in a positive way. In a research project, the expected result for most funding agencies is that the work results in publishable, peer-reviewed articles in journals, and so that's a little bit different. There's lower predictability of agricultural development projects. There's a bit higher risk as compared to research, where there's a higher predictability and a lower risk. So those are just kind of a brief comparison of those two kinds of activities. Most of you, I think, are familiar with the logic model. That's typically one of the tools that's used to develop a project, agricultural development. I know all of you in research are well familiar with the scientific method. We learned this long ago. In this, we go through the process of developing, doing some research on it, stating a problem, doing the research on it, literature research. We develop a hypothesis, we test it, and we analyze the data. You're all familiar with that. So the approach is a little bit different when we talk about a research project. But the common thread between those two, a very important common thread, is they need to be evidence-based. There needs to be clear evidence. And so now we talk about evidence-based medicine, evidence-based fitness, evidence-based education. So these things are not just opinions by people, but actually they have evidence. And so that's really important. And that's our competitive advantage in terms, I think, of universities and research organizations, is we understand how to generate and hopefully analyze evidence. Types of things we're talking about when we talk about evidence is repeated field observations by multiple persons. If a farmer comes in and says, I use this variety and every time it out-yields everything else, and we hear that from multiple sources, we have to start to consider that as evidence, that variety is better than others. Expert opinions can be very important. We've heard lots of expert opinions here. We all have our opinions. Now, we have to be careful about what does constitute an expert. I've known people that say, well, if a person agrees with me, they're an expert. Or their definition of an intelligent person is anyone who agrees with them. And so we have to be careful how we look at expert opinions, and then think about the motive. Why is the person, do they have some kind of motive that might cause their opinion to be less objective? So those are things we need to think about. And then, of course, the gold standard for evidence is refereed, peer-reviewed journal articles that are based on replicated, rigorous experimentation and statistical analysis of the data. That's gold standard. Those of you at universities, you know that. The publish or perish model is still in place. You can't survive at a university if you're not able to do this type of research. Now, I do want to add a caution about peer review. I've been an editor for the Journal of the American Society for Horticultural Sciences. I was an editor for about 4 years. And you learn pretty quickly that peer review involves humans, and humans are not perfect. It's not uncommon. And as I served as an editor, I reviewed many, many papers. And it's not uncommon to get highly contrasting reviews of the same paper. And you wonder, did the reviewers read the same paper? Did I send the wrong paper? Or how did they get different views? So one might say, well, this research is carefully conducted with proper experimental design. Data were properly analyzed and the conclusions are sound. I recommend publication contingent upon minor revision. So that reviewer's happy, but then I open the next review, says this research was ill-conceived, poorly conducted, conclusions drawn are not supported by reliable data. I recommend this paper be rejected with no opportunity for resubmission. In other words, it stinks. Or maybe even the author should be banished from the face of the earth. Sometimes it gets pretty ugly. And so you have to, as an editor, figure out, okay, who do I believe? Do I do a third review? Do I do the review? And so it's not a perfect process. It's the best we have, but it's not perfect, and it makes mistakes. Now, if we go back and look and compare development and research now with the lens of our USAID Innovation Lab, we'll see this is a hybrid between research for development purposes. And so now let's think about this. Yes, the project, the overall project, the managing entity is a big job. It's broad in scope. The specific research projects that will eventually be funded are going to still be narrow in scope. Will be relatively large amounts of funding now are available for the Innovation Lab. It's in millions. And then there will be smaller amounts available for the research projects, probably in thousands, but it may be significant. Some of them may even get up to $1 million or more, depending on their nature. The development hypothesis, we've already talked about how this lab has already been developed through a theory of change that Aaron shared yesterday. We're going to absolutely need to see a clear scientific hypothesis that's followed by rigorous use of the scientific method for projects that are funded. And I don't know who exactly will end up reviewing these. That's still to be determined. But certainly if I'm a reviewer, that's one of the things I want to see, that the scientific method is being followed. The work plan has been developed now, but it was after the project was funded. And the work plan for your research should be developed before the proposal is funded. That's still a difference that's true. In terms of the managing entity, there's many participants, many partners, as we know. We're here. Fewer participants, fewer partners in the research project. Strengthening local capacity is still critical, very critical. And the mantra for this lab is locally led but globally supported. We have capacity strengthening as a secondary benefit. I'm going to say no in this case. I think because the nature of Innovation Lab, I think it's very important that we do have demonstrated capacity development. So that's a little different than our typical research project. Political and influence being present is okay and it's welcome in a development aspect. And yeah, we don't want politics influencing the research. But we can't be ignorant. We can't be in the ivory tower, as some of you mentioned. We have to understand there are political realities in the world, and we have to be aware of those. The expected results are still landscape-level impacts. Yes, journal articles would be great if we generate journal articles, but that's not going to be enough for this kind of an effort. It also has to be impactful journal articles where we can show that things have changed in a positive way. Lower predictability, higher risk. I think that's still true for this. What I would say for higher predictability and lower risk, we might need to be a little less risk averse, take a few more chances on a project like this than we might normally do. So those are just some things to think about. Now, the other thing I'd caution us and keep in mind is that research conclusions are typically based on a 95% level of statistical probability. We've learned that in our research. We celebrate when we analyze our data, and it's significant at the 95% level. We sometimes forget that also means there's a 5% chance you're wrong and that the results are not really real in terms of what we see, because there is that statistical probability. And that's something a mentor once taught me. He said, just because you haven't proven anything with this, so you have to be aware of that statistical probability. And also statistical significance, even though we may celebrate and have a chicken dance or whatever when we get our data at the 95% level, it doesn't mean it has real-world utilitarian significance. So, for example, if a practice increases yield by 3% and it's statistically significant, that's great for publishing, but it may not mean anything in terms of actual practice because the cost of doing that practice may be more than the benefit, the economic benefit. It may have adverse environmental impact that we have to consider, might have social impacts if it reduces jobs in a market where jobs are really important. So we have to keep that in mind. And as Albert Einstein, I think he put it best, he says, not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted. So it's good to keep that in mind. It's, we scientists were very numbers oriented, but sometimes it's not in the numbers. So just to conclude, we're going to have both development and research approaches, I think, to be successful here. A very important factor for our success will be the implementation of evidence-based approaches, and well-documented impacts are going to be needed, whether they're horticultural, social, economic, environmental. It's going to be an important end result of this lab's work. So with that, that's your appetizer for dinner. Now you have food for thought. You can now think about that and talk about it and we can talk in the hallways. I know everyone is tired, but we now need to know what you think about this. I think it's really important, and it's great that you're here. The input is wonderful. I know UC Davis will appreciate it. So with that, I will conclude. So thank you for your attention and staying here a long day. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Prof. Tim. Do we have any questions or comments?
Tim, very happy to see the slide, and I've heard Dr. Rosike tell me that he needs the slides. So it means that if she needs it, it means it's good. It means you have done well, isn't it? Yes. My question is on the recent issue. You know, I heard I'm the chair of the Innovation Lab Capacity Development Working Group. And recently, USAID brought what is capacity building. And on their scale, you know, they price what is a full capacity building and what is not fully a capacity building. The Innovation Lab is a grant given to U.S. universities. And traditionally, U.S. universities have been coming to Africa, Asia, and other things and working for partners. Since it's a grant being given to U.S. universities like we are at A&M, how do you see Africans taking part of it and going through the spectrum of development and research, you know, and giving the leadership in order to be able to do it, and with the very peer review where one is said is good and one is said is not good? How do we navigate that? And what is your university effort to give Africans ownership of evidence generation that can be used to support policy making on the continent?
Sure, yeah, very good question. And I think I can't speak for the entire consortium, but I believe what will happen is that there will be this call for proposals coming out, and those will need to be led by African universities with hopefully collaboration where the capacity may be weak. Then we augment that with either somebody from Texas A&M or UC Davis or one of our other partners. We have World Veg, we have Florida A&M. There's a variety of partners. And so I think, you know, that's what we would be looking for, that, you know, if they have demonstrated capacity and it's all people from Africa, great, but it may not be that way. And so if there's gaps, you know, monitoring and evaluation is commonly not done very well. You know, even in the U.S. we don't do that well. So maybe we need to, you know, get help on that part of it. But that's how I think we will see it. I mentioned also what we've picked up on lately at our institute, and I don't know if others who work with USAID have seen this. They now are preferring the term rather than capacity building. They like strengthening, because it's sort of offensive to come into a country and say you have no capacity. You have capacity. I mean, I've met you. You have capacity. It's just sometimes it needs some strengthening. And that's really it. There's smart people here. They're talented people. And so USAID is telling us at least to use the term strengthening capacity as opposed to building it or developing it. So that's another point I think that relates to your question. And so we really do want to strengthen the capacity. There's researchers here. We know that. They have some constraints. We've heard a lot about that. We now have some funding, so we can't complain about funding. We do have funding. Again, I have to write a competitive proposal, but that's part of the capacity building, right, is to convince a grant panel to fund you. And so that's part of that capacity strengthening. So does that help? Does that answer?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you. Any other question?
Yes, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much. Talking of strengthening capacity, I'd like to capitalize much more on that. Yes, we have teams of researchers. We have people from the academia. But truly, I think it is also good in this project, or maybe we also need to think of training much more. And of course, maybe at master's and PhD levels, And this training it can majorly aim at partnership between the different universities, whereby maybe students can have time to go to another institution, maybe a funding institution like UC Davis, then a research topic which is based on the horticulture sector challenge, practical challenge which is facing the sector within the Africa continent. That's where the research will be directed. And also for the senior researchers and people in the academia, they can also have benchmarking trainings. Maybe they can have training in other parts of the countries which are performing better than here. That's what I was just thinking. Thank you.
Yes, very good points. Regarding students, I do believe there is a mechanism, and Hillary, you may know a little bit about this, but I believe there's going to be some money set aside for students and graduate. I don't know if it's going to be full assistantships, but there will be a portion of the budget. I know there was in the last innovation lab. I can't remember the name of these. They've given
capacity demonstration.
Yeah, capacity. And so students will. I think it is very important that we do that. If we fail that, it's really hard without helping the youth in this. It's really, really hard to strengthen capacity in any kind of lasting way. So that's a good point, and I think that will happen. So yes, thank you. Good points.
Thank you. I think that brings us to the end. Is there any last burning?
Thank you very much. I just wanted to weigh in on that capacity building. I think also as the target market of donor funds, as Africans, we also need to come to the table with clarity on what we are asking for. We must have a lot of clarity on what we are best placed to understand our problems. So we must be able to articulate our problems. So our researchers should be able to understand our problems and bring them to the table for the donor to deal with, vis-a-vis what normally happens where the donor, what would the word be? The donor diagnoses our problem and suggests their solution for our problem. So it is important for us to be able to diagnose our problem, bring it to the table with suitable or proposals of solutions to them, and then the discussion on the table will be, is it doable or not doable, and getting options and solutions from markets that have solved it.
Thank you very much. As you are aware, we are running the Innovation Lab for Market Risk and Resiliency. And when the opportunity was given to us and we did the solicitation, we received 168 expression of interest. And I think the full proposal we received was 124. When we did the first cut, and Tim, I'm glad that Tim shows the development and research. Almost 60 of them were just a project proposals coming from African researchers. You know, the difference between what is a project proposal and a research proposal. So 64 of them were thrown away. It didn't even go for peer review. The 60 that went for peer review, only 28 were recommended for funding. And out of the 28, we were able to fund only 12. So you see, 168 to 124 to 12. Currently, we are funding the 12. So as you said, I'm anchoring what you are saying, that it's not just money for grab. It's sitting down and strengthening our capacity, not developing our capacity. You know, and being in a position to competitively, you know, write a research grant that are fundable. You know, these are the issues that we face as Africans, that we take things for granted. And maybe we haven't got the opportunity to do try and error. and what we have done is that those who wrote the proposal, or the 168, we have been organizing, research grant workshop for them and other things so that they can be able to compete. But think about it, 168 and only 12 of them were fundable. So these are some of the challenges, and I'm glad that you have brought it up. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that suffices. And Tim doesn't need to add on anything. So please resume your set. Thank you. Let's give a round of applause to Tim with a bit of energy. It's the end of the day. Thank you very much. So we're coming to the end of the day. I apologize that we have extended the time by half an hour. I think we've had very useful, detailed information and exchange of ideas that we could not simply run through the program and check the box. I think we were looking for specific things, and we have been able to come that far, and we are glad that this has been a productive day.